And now I'd like to bring in our expert panel, Meir Javed-Anfar, Iran lecturer at Reichman University right here in Israel, and in Washington, D.C., Behnam bin Taleblu, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. So we've been seeing a very hectic week regarding Iran, things happening in Iran and in Israel and in Washington. And that's, Behnam, when nothing happens on the big arena, which is the attempt to reach a new nuclear deal. That is stuck.
There are multiple arenas of conflict and competition with the Islamic Republic. And if you're following, and if the audience is following a lot of the press reporting that's coming out about Israel allegedly being behind the latest assassination inside of Iran, not just of a nuclear scientist, but this time of a specific IRGC Quds Force individual who was part of a larger unit that was designed to kidnap and lure and target Israelis abroad, that it means that there's a shift in the game. And actually, there is actually something of a linkage between these different tracks, between the political nuclear track in Vienna as well as what's going on in the region. Because if one does believe this larger string of sabotage and attacks is actually linked to Israel, then it's Israel trying to say to the international community, deal or no deal, the world does need to try to stop these other changing, evolving threats emanating from the Islamic Republic, likely from the likes of someone like Khodai.
So, Meir, allegedly, let's assume Israel is behind this killing in Tehran. What is Israel trying to signal to Iran and maybe to the West, led by the US as well?
Well, I think there is concern, especially now, because the Russians are going to be leaving, at least they're going to be withdrawing part of their forces from Syria. And we saw as soon as that news was known to the international press, the very next day, Mr. Bashar al-Assad flew to Tehran and met with Ayatollah Khamenei. Excuse me. And that, I think, creates the concern that the more there's a vacuum in Syria, the more Iran could fill it and the more dangerous it could become for the state of Israel especially. I think the Turks are also taking steps to fill in that vacuum because they are also concerned about the departure of Russia. Or withdrawal part of forces of Russia. But back to Israel, I think there seems to be concern that the danger and the threat from Syria by Iran could increase. And according to reports, the person who was killed in Iran, Mr. Khodai, belonged to an IRGC unit whose goal was to harm Israelis. And I think this also would have played a part in calculations if Israel was really behind this strike.
But Meir, such an attack, such a killing, does it deter Iran from continuing to do things like that? Or maybe it pushes it to the corner and forcing her to revenge and retaliate?
Well, I don't think there's any single attack that could completely deter Iran, but I think it does create there's just a perception in Iran that Iran's Syrian policies are, especially anti-Israel Syrian policies. Look, Israel doesn't have a problem with Iran dealing with Bashar al-Assad economically or doing the way it was before the 2011 civil war in Syria. But Israel's problem is that Iran wants to turn Syria into a Lebanon. This kind of increases the cost for Iran for its current Syria policy to use Syrian territory to threaten the state of Israel.
So, Behnam, back to you. Let's speak of what's going on in Iran, because we see a greater amount of demonstrations and we see the prices rising. And still, those who hope in the West for the regime to collapse get disappointed.
The string of protests we've seen from 2017 to present, including in Abadan just this week, for instance, are tied to much larger issues, economic, social, religious, environmental, security even, but they're sustained by a larger political grievance from the street against the state in the Islamic Republic. And these are explicitly anti-regime protests, basically calling for a straight-up revolution inside the country. And that's where Washington, with its nuclear-only policy, is making a mistake by ignoring these protesters, by only belatedly tweeting even rhetorical support, as you saw the State Department do, and not being able to put any meat on the bone behind the phrase, what does it mean to stand with or support the Iranian people?
But Behnam, explain that, please, to our viewers. If Iran is in such a social and economic chaotic situation, Why isn't it going on to sign the nuclear accord, giving up a few things, but gaining a lot of money by lifting the sanctions, getting billions of dollars that have been freezed, and practically being able, to free the people or to give them some air?
This is an excellent point because there have been many economic triggers for street protests in Iran recently, but the way the regime over the past year and a half has been able to limp along means that they don't necessarily look for sanctions relief to feed the people domestically. Sanctions relief, cash transfers, cash infusions, market access is designed to bolster Iran's nuclear program, its regional security strategy. And the thing that touched off these recent protests is subsidy reform. Subsidy reform is challenging even for a legal, legitimate, democratically elected government that has money in the bank. This is the Islamic Republic believing that what it can't make up for there, it has sufficient coercive apparatus to literally fight back protesters, as it's been doing for the past week and a half. So this is a sign of overconfidence by the regime, still saying no to sanctions relief offers, as well as engaging in a very complex game of subsidy reform on Iran's multi-exchange rate tiered system.
So, Meir, it seems like the last obstacle which stops sides from reaching a new deal is the American decision not to take the IRGC out of the list of terror groups. Groups of supporting terror. What's the importance in that, and what's the role the IRGC are practically filling within the world of terrorism?
It's symbolic in a way, because even if you allow the IRGC, if you remove their name, you can still, their sanctions are not going to be removed. You can still sanction them. There's still many sanctions available. But I think there's the issue here that the Americans, there's two issues here. Number one, the issue of the IRGC is not related to the nuclear deal. The Americans have said we are willing to remove all nuclear-related sanctions which were imposed by Trump. But this is not a nuclear-related sanction. The other issue here is that the Americans want to negotiate on a quid pro quo. Okay, they're saying to the Iranians, okay, if we do this, if we remove the IRGC from the terror list, what are you willing to do for us? And the Iranians currently are saying nothing. And I think this is another issue why the Americans are not showing any compromise over this.
Behnam, you agree on that?
Well, I agree, but also with immense respect to my friend and colleague Mira, disagree about the IRGC status being only politically symbolic on the terror list. This is the most stigmatic, far-reaching, legally and economic, powerful terrorism authority that the U.S. wields, and there's a reason why Iran is demanding it. It actually wants to be able to say that it forced the great Satan to give up its most powerful penalty without Iran having to change a thing. It's the ability that allows the U.S. court system to be weaponized against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. There's lots of things that the IRGC FTO designation actually provides the non-military side of U.S. leverage against the Iranians, and that's why the regime understands it, and that's why the regime has been willing to risk so much for it. But my ultimate fear here is IRGC FTO, yes or no, that the deal as it's currently structured and the deal as it's currently being reported would still give large banks that underwrite Iran's terrorism apparatus sanctions relief. And that is a problem because it's non-nuclear sanctions relief, allegedly in a nuclear-only deal.
Behnam bin Taleblu in Washington, Meir Javed Anfar here in Israel. Thank you both for joining us today.